Hi, my name's Kirsty Page, and today I'd like to talk to you about how the Launchpad for Literacy Toolkit can help you with identifying and tackling barriers to phonic readiness and progression. And hopefully, this short video will do two things for those people who already have a Launchpad for Literacy Toolkit. It will help leaders to understand how Launchpad can be used for this application and to focus on these things. And for anybody who just wants to find out a little bit more about Launchpad, particularly for this application, hopefully this video will help those people too. So Launchpad helps us to understand what phonic readiness is. It helps us to understand which developmental skills feed directly into phonic readiness progression and which skills in the Launchpad Toolkit feed in less to phonic readiness than others. So when it comes to this application, we don't necessarily have to be looking at or thinking about all of the skills on the Launchpad Skills Framework. We can just be looking at those that really underpin and feed into phonic readiness and progression. And that same thinking was used when we talked about using Launchpad to support phonic preparation. But here, what we're going to do is to think about how Launchpad sits alongside that more formal teaching of phonics for some children in relation to phonics. So as I've mentioned before in other videos, I certainly do not think that Launchpad interferes with an SSP. It doesn't interfere with the fidelity to that SSP. But what Launchpad can be seen as doing in schools is underpinning your SSP so that it informs a more detailed diet of phonic preparation. That's a different application discussed on a different video. But also for this application, it sits alongside the SSP so that when children are not ready, when children are for some reason not making progress alongside our SSP, we can use Launchpad as a gap identification and gap tackling toolkit. So in terms of this application, I think the most obvious children that Launchpad can help you with are those children who are overtly not ready. You know, those children where if you're working with the 4 to 5 year olds in England, we would call that reception. When children are walking through your door, you know, you're thinking, my goodness me, this child is not ready for the formal and systematic teaching of phonics. And do you know what? You are probably right. But what we've got to do is think, like, okay, what are we going to do about that? How are we going to support that child to make progress? And this is where the Launchpad Toolkit comes in to help you. Really, what we've got to do is we've got to embrace our feelings about the child not being ready. And we haven't got to ignore their not readiness. We really need to get to grips with it because no matter what some people say, the gaps, the developmental gaps, the skill gaps that are making us realize that that child is not ready, they are going to cause a problem for that child if we don't do something about it. So what we've got to do is use Launchpad as a gap identification toolkit. So if we understand the skill strands that feed directly into phonic readiness, we look to those skill strands to find out where the gaps are. We really need to clarify and quantify what does not ready look and sound like for this child. Where are the gaps? Do they have gaps with all of the skills that feed directly into phonic readiness? Or are some of this child's skills strong, but they have gaps with this, and that is going to cause them a problem if we don't address that. So really, where there are gaps, again, that gap identification process of saying, I don't just want to say they've got a gap with sequential auditory memory. I don't just want to say that they've got a gap with fine motor skills. I want to say within that skill where there is a gap, what can the child do? So Launchpad allows me to go back and establish that level of success, and also the incremental progression that underpins the skills framework in Launchpad will allow me to work from that level of success What do they need to do next? What would the next step be to close that gap and work that child towards the point of readiness? And once I understand what the gaps are, what the next steps are, what do we need to put in place to work this child towards readiness? What do we need to put in place to begin to remove this gap that is acting as a barrier to readiness? And of course, what we always do is look at what we're doing already before we add extra bits in or tweak our practice to address that gap filling. So for most children, this tackling of gaps to address readiness would sit alongside the SSP. And for some children, their gaps might be so extensive that we realise that actually going along for the ride and joining in the formal whole class teaching of phonics is not appropriate for this child. But if we're going to make that decision for those few individual children, we need to have a clear idea of exactly what the phonic preparation curriculum continues to need to be for that child. And that is very much also something that specialist provisions will have to consider, where maybe on different literacy pathways, groups of children, cohorts of children are not ready for the systematic teaching of formal phonics, but we also need to be able to say why we're making that decision. And we also need to be able to make decisions about what the detailed phonic preparation diet, what the phonic curriculum for those children needs to look like. And again, Launchpad can help you there. So really what we're saying for these children is we need to identify the gaps, we need to embrace their not readiness, clarify and quantify it, and realize that these children need additional things in order to remove those barriers. And what children don't need is to just get started, ignore the readiness, and just put them into that treadmill of just doing more and more of the same, where they're going to find it very tricky and where they're not going to make progress. We've got other children, though, that Launchpad can help you with, and those are those children where they might be okay with certain elements of phonics, but there are issues with progression with other elements. So say, for example, they might be learning to recognize all their letters, their phoneme, grapheme, correspondence knowledge might be okay, but for some reason they're just not moving into blending. And what Launchpad allows us to do is to identify those hidden gaps that are acting as barriers for children like that. And we can either identify them when an issue comes up through those initial stages of learning phonics, or for some people, what they choose to do is, why wait for there to be a problem at the start of the year? Let's check these skills with all of our children and let's uncover those hidden gaps before it actually causes a problem with progression for some of our children. And that's all up to you as leaders. We can go one way or the other. There's no right or wrong. It's about what works for you, your team, and your children. So because we understand which skills feed directly into phonic readiness and progression, we can take it that step further, and we can understand which skills feed more directly into blending, for example, which skills feed more directly into phoneme, grapheme, correspondence knowledge, etc., etc., so that we can really begin to fine-tune our gap identification and gap closing process. And really, again, with children like this, and I work with lots of schools where we talk through this and the CPD and the toolkit, you wouldn't, again, be thinking, I've got to assess this child on everything to do with Launchpad. And I probably don't even need to assess them on all the skills that feed into phonics. I start the ball rolling by thinking, well, what can the child do? What does the child do well? And if the child is doing an element of phonics well, we're probably not going to have to identify a gap that's acting as a barrier in certain skill strands, because if there was a gap there, they wouldn't be doing well with that. So we can kind of rule that out as an issue. But what do they find tricky, and which skill strands feed directly into that sub-elements of phonics? So where we know the skill strands that feed directly into the aspect of phonics that they're finding tricky, we can begin again that same process, but in a much more narrow way of those skill strands. Where are there gaps? Are there gaps in one of them, two of them, all of them? And where there are gaps, what can the child do? And what does the child need to do next? Again, I'm not interested in saying this child is not blending or this child is a non-blender. I'm interested in finding out why they can't blend when we've done that quite well and the child has had lots of repetition. And I'm also interested in finding out, is there anything that they can blend and can I move them on from that point? And Launchpad will really help me to make those decisions and find all of that information out. So again, sub aspects of phonic progression that Launchpad can help me with will be issues with phoneme, grapheme correspondence knowledge, which might begin with having a difficulty with all letters, remembering more than a small handful of letters. The difficulty could emerge when letters become similar, like D's and B's and P's and Q's. It could be that a child has issues moving into digraphs or trigraphs. So again, at whatever point this becomes an issue, we can begin to look for gaps and reasons why. We can understand the skill strands that feed directly into blending. So for children who are struggling with blending and another element of phonics, we can look at that. Or for lots of our children, as we know, they'll be okay with other elements of the phonics, but it's just the blending that is the sticking block. Phonics can really help me with that, whether those children are in reception or whether those children have moved further up the school. And again, Launchpad will help me look at phonic writing and what is it that's going on there, where are the gaps and what can I do to support progression. In another application video, we will look at the wider applications for writing, including phonic writing, because writing is much broader than just phonics. But again, if it's phonic level writing that a child is finding tricky, we can use Launchpad to support that too. And what we need to do once we've found out where the gaps are, what the level of success is, what the next steps are, we can weave that into what I would call informed interventions, where our interventions are kind of designed and bespoke based on what we know these children need, based on what we know about their gaps and next steps, so that interventions become include gap closing activities where we're working towards next steps. So we're working towards removing the barriers so that children can move into blending, so that children can make progress with phoneme grapheme correspondence from the level that they're at the minute. And as well as kind of thinking about our intervention sessions, we can also think about how can we weave those next steps into our targeted practice outside of phonic interventions. How can we weave moving that skill on within our quality first teaching, within our learning environment, within our provision. And certainly in Key Stage 1, for people who still have continuous provision elements there, how can we use our learning environment to weave gap closing in? And really what we're doing here is we're identifying gaps, but we're looking for progression. Launchpad is all about supporting progression, particularly for our most vulnerable children. And it is not an anti-phonic message at all. If anything, Launchpad is about supporting phonic readiness and progression. But what we're openly kind of saying is where children have gaps, they will cause an issue. Let's get to grips with that. Let's address that. Let's not just ignore that. And that is really valuable for our vulnerable children. And if we want to get our progression going with those children, if we're wanting to get attainment higher for a bigger percentage of children, we are going to need to look at gap identification and gap closing alongside our SSP. An SSP alone will only take us so far. And again, really what we're kind of saying is what are we going to do for those children where more and more of the same, where that repetitive diet of phonics again and again just isn't working? What are we going to do? And how are we going to support progression for those children? And what I would like to say is that Launchpad will give you the key to that door. So here are contact details. We've got the website. We've got my personal contact detail if you've got any questions or if you want to email me directly. We've got the general Launchpad email address there if you want to email with any inquiries or orders. And again, on YouTube, we have videos about other applications and other elements of Launchpad. So feel free to explore those. Thank you very much for your time.